Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the inaugural Conversations with Dad podcast. The internet has been abuzz lately with a topic near and dear to its heart: net neutrality. After having scoured YouTube, I found a great deal of doom and gloom, and as well as suggestions from people on how to solve our present crisis. So I got to thinking, maybe I should talk to an actual expert on the topic, a telecommunications engineer, for instance. Well, I spent all of 5 minutes and found one. My father, Jim Sackman, and I'd figured I'd send some questions his way so that he might illuminate the rest of us on what's going on. So, hey, Dad, would you like to give us a little bit of history on our present situation?
Sure, Chris. The telecommunications issues today, especially net neutrality and the internet, come out of the Telecommunications Act of 1996 and the way the internet was regulated post that bill from Congress by the FCC. In particular, the fact that the FCC declared internet service an information service instead of a common carrier service. The reason it did so is, remember, it was 1996. The internet was very new. Most people still had dial-up service, and it was unclear how the internet was going to evolve. So an information service is essentially an unregulated service by the FCC, and they thought that was the best stance to take at the time. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Exactly. What are the rules for an information service, and we can later contrast that to compare and contrast to common carriers.
Yeah, essentially the rules for an information service are there are no rules. The way that information services were originally considered were communication services for enterprises, for businesses. And in most businesses, especially large businesses, those are custom agreements between the set of telecommunications carriers that they rent bandwidth from, and the business. So those are very custom agreements. They're not regulated by the FCC at all. Essentially, people can set up any kind of arrangement they want, and the carrier can charge whatever it feels like to those businesses. And they compete. The carriers compete for those businesses because they tend to be big pipes, charge a lot of money for them. So they're completely custom arrangements. By declaring residential internet service, which is the one we most care about and touch, the issue is that the level of regulation that can be applied to those services is very low.
Okay, so when you say they're for big businesses, is this kind of an internal thing, or is it, as you're saying, customized? Like it could theoretically be anything.
It could theoretically be anything. So if you go back in time, people used to lease telephone lines from place to place. They still actually do that today, or lease bandwidth, or dark fiber, or any of those custom arrangements. When I was with Edgewave, we actually re-rented a fiber optic interface from Rohnert Park to Palo Alto or San Jose from AT&T, and that was a dedicated set of fiber bandwidth that we got directly from AT&T. A general consumer couldn't get that bandwidth because that's an information service. It's a non-regulated service. It's a non-tariffed service, so there's no standard price for it defined by the government or defined by the Public Utility Commission or the FCC. Doesn't mean that AT&T doesn't have a standard price list or a way of calculating a standard price. It just means that those are custom deals or custom arrangements set up by AT&T with its customers, in that case, Edgewave.
Okay, so let's contrast that to a Title II common carrier is what kind of the FCC and people are suggesting that ISP should be labeled under now.
Yeah, a Title II common carrier is a regulated and tariff service. So what does that mean? It means that the rules imposed on it are very strict, and complete neutrality is required in the allocation of bandwidth. So all all common carriage bandwidth must be treated the same. On top of that, by being tariffed, that means prices get regulated as well. So a tariff service means that a carrier has to file a price with the public utility commissions and the FCC. Once a public tariff goes in place, you can't set up custom arrangements around that particular service. They'd create a different version of that service to sell to businesses if they wanted to sell it for a different price. So there's ways of getting around it that are pretty standard and are pretty well utilized. One of the big deltas for that is, let me contrast that to what goes on in an information service. A business can then, because it's got a custom arrangement with a carrier, if the carrier wants to, if the carrier and the enterprise want to set up a way that some data takes precedence over some other data, that's completely legitimate in an information service. That's a standard arrangement, can be built at any time, can be controlled by either the carrier, by the enterprise, or by a combination of the interaction between the two. In other words, the enterprise can signal to the carrier how to treat the data. And that's very useful in a lot of enterprise applications.
And so just to, get the lexicon here, when you're saying enterprise, you just, whatever the customer, let's say, and then the carrier is the ISP?
Yeah, and enterprise has a specific meaning in my mind, and these are business services. So if you look at most carrier web pages, they will differentiate between business services and residential services. And business services often break down into what will be termed small business services and then enterprise services, which are generally targeted at larger businesses. And if you think about it, there are literally millions of residential terminations in the United States, residential connections, and the number of enterprise connections is on the order of a few 100,000. So there's a big difference in the numbers and how you're managing them. So, for example, when I was with AFC, we had 3 45 megabit pipes coming into our headquarters in Petaluma. That's a pretty standard arrangement, or was a pretty standard arrangement for somebody of that size, and we had about 1,000 employees. So we were a mid-sized business. We were an enterprise customer. EdgeWave was a lot smaller company, but was actually a service provider. So like I said, we had a 100 megabit dedicated fiber connection between our Rohnert Park headquarters, where we had about 40 people, and our San Jose data center. And then we rented GigEs out of our data centers, both the one in San Jose and the one in Ashburn, from 2 different carriers. So those are the kind of arrangements, what I mean, an enterprise arrangement. A residential one, the contrast here is between resident and business, really, more than anything else.
Okay. So let's kind of get into the current crisis. I'm using quotation, my air quotes.
Mm-hmm.
So 2014, the FCC, I believe it's the 8.1 purpose, basically them saying they want to, I don't have the wording right in front of me, but basically make all information equal, and that you can't, discriminate between various bits. And that sounds a lot like that they want to make ISPs into common carrier service, which has been something they've been running into the last few decades as they've tried to want to regulate the ISPs, but haven't had the laws in place to do so. So that they've wanted to change ISPs into common carriers so that they're able to regulate them in a reasonable fashion, or at least have a set of laws to regulate the ISPs in some way.
So I need to back you up.
Assessment?
No, it's not.
Okay.
So and remember the law, the prevalent law here, and there's a difference between laws and rules, and I want to make that distinction first, and then we'll move on to the current situation. Laws are things that are generated by Congress. So the controlling law here is the Telecommunications Act of 1996. When a law is enacted, a regulatory body like the Federal Communications Commission doesn't have enough information in a bill. And you've seen some of these things if you've ever looked at like the Affordable Care Act, which might be 1,000 pages. Even with that 1,000 pages, there's simply not enough technical detail to allow the FCC to regulate the services. So they write their own set of rules. Those are which are not laws, but they're rules controlled underneath the law. So in other words, they say, here's what the law says. This is how we're going to implement this law. Okay, and that's the rules, and those are generated by the FCC. Both are controlled by the courts, or can be overviewed by the courts. And what's happened is, as the internet's evolved, and the internet started, depending on how you look at it, in the early 70s, but it didn't become a residential phenomena until the early 1990s. So 1994 is when the first real browsers came out for residential use. And then broadband service really started in 1999, maybe 1998. And not until the early 2000s was broadband service readily available and prevalent. And so really we're 10 years into this. So it's a very fast, it seems like it's slow from a young person's standpoint, but in terms of regulatory issues and technology, it's all relatively recent. Now, what's happened is the FCC defined internet service right after the adoption of the Telecom Act of 1996 as this information service. So it's relatively unregulated. In other words, all kinds of custom arrangements could be created. There weren't a lot of rules in place. And the reason is, as I said at the open, there wasn't a view to how this is going to evolve. If you went back to 1996 and said, this is the way it's going to look in 2014, nobody would have believed you, right? Nobody would have had an idea of how this was all going to evolve. And so, somebody will say, oh, yes, I did. But the reality is the bulk of us didn't. So the FCC wanted to keep its hands off what was going on because there were concerns that if they regulated this too tightly, that they might disrupt innovation. And that's a real concern. It's happened in the past. If you think about the phone system today is not greatly different than the phone system of 100 years ago. And in fact, if you plug in a phone that's 100 years old, it'll still work. Now, if you plugged in a browser that was from 20 years ago, I'm not sure you'd be very happy with the result. Right? So you have to just think about it in those kind of time frames, and that's different than what a lot of people think about. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I get that it started off as kind of people use the metaphor as the Wild West, kind of. And
it's still the Wild West.
Yeah.
So what's happened now is there's been this issue, and probably the best way to think about it is actually in wireless service. If you go back before the iPhone, there were types of internet service or kind of information screens available on some cell phones. You could buy ringtones. I don't know how much you remember this. And there were Blackberries, and you could do early forms of texting via Blackberries. And those services were delivered by the carriers, and it's what's called a walled garden service. And that means that the carrier controlled it, and they made money off of it. So that type of service, of course, doesn't create a lot of innovation, right? And so the iPhone, when it came out, it completely blew away those old style phones because it allowed for open and free communications via the internet and wireless. And that's why the iPhone became so popular and all the changes that have occurred on the mobile side. So taking a look at that, you can see where the FCC is greatly concerned about the possibility that internet service providers and other large companies, and the companies involved in all this, are Goliaths. We're talking about, on one side, AT&T and Verizon, as well as Comcast and Time Warner, and very large companies on the internet side. And then on the content side, you've got Google, Disney, Fox. It's Comcast again because they own NBC Universal. And so these are massive organizations, all of which are bumping around, and The FCC's job is actually to make all this work for the consumer. Now, that doesn't work out that way in most things and may not work out again for us, and that's why people are concerned. Now, what's happened is the FCC's tried to put in some what they would consider light touch rules. Some rules that say, hey, you can't discriminate on traffic. You have to leave everybody the same. Not trying to enforce all the rules of common carriage, but try to make everybody aware that that's the idea, that they want people to treat traffic as common carriage. Now, every time they do this, the courts overturn the FCC rules. And the reason is there's no way for them to regulate an information service. So they're all...
quick, can I...
Sure.
So this would be like what happened in 2010 with the open internet order?
Yes.
Where Verizon didn't like that because it felt it was too much like common carriers?
That's correct.
Okay.
So, and just recently, the courts overturned all this stuff yet again. And so the FCC sent out a document. It's a very standard thing that they do, which is in the acronym world, an NPRM, or in the English world, a notice of proposed rulemaking. In other words, they're saying, hey, we think we need to make some rules. In other words, there's something here that we need to regulate via the law. We'd like comments about what people would like out of this. So they haven't said here's what we're going to do. They've said, hey, we're thinking we need to do something. Can you tell us what you think we might want to do? And that has created an uproar. Part of the uproar comes from the fact that they've asked people for commentary around things which are not net neutral. And then that has created quite a firestorm around this particular notice of proposed rulemaking.
Well, and since the topic of our little podcast here is about neutrality or net neutrality, maybe you should give us a definition on, at least from an insider perspective, and compared to potentially what the layman's term of net neutrality is.
That's a great question, and everybody has a slightly different definition of it, and that's one of the problems. I could argue that today net neutrality doesn't exist if I felt like it, but essentially the idea would be is that all traffic on the internet that's crossing the internet is treated exactly the same. That there's no discrimination between traffic types. There's no recognition of different kinds of traffic and treating them any different than any other kind of traffic. That's, I would say, the simplest definition for anybody. And
as you kind of alluded to, you don't feel that is, at least maybe not 100% enforced, or I'm not sure how to say it.
It's definitely not. The rules as they stand today don't require it.
Oh, okay. So,
and just to back up, so
okay.
All these things about like the open internet order, we're trying to tell the internet service providers, please don't discriminate on traffic, and the courts keep knocking them down. So, as an information service, because there's custom arrangements, the internet service providers can actually discriminate across traffic today. Now they know they're gonna get in trouble with the FCC if they do it in a way there's a couple of terms and there's some mealy-mouthed words, but if they do it in a way that disrupts somebody's service, they know the FCC is going to come down on them. How that all works out, that's a really good question. I don't know if you remember Verizon's argument over BitTorrent about maybe 5 or 6 years ago, where they tried to block BitTorrent.
Yeah, I don't remember their argument, but I do remember that they did that.
Well, they lost that, so the FCC made them stop doing that. So just remember that this is not a new argument across the board here. And recently, Netflix had a disagreement, shall we say, with Comcast over how Comcast was treating Netflix traffic. Now, for people that are listening, they should know we're both a Comcast customer and a Netflix customer, and in fact, we're recording this across Comcast service. Um, I don't. I never noticed any issues with our Netflix service during the point of this argument. I don't know if you did.
I generally don't use it enough, but no, I didn't in particular.
Yeah. So I know people said there were problems. I didn't notice any, and that's what I've told people just flat out because I want them to know that we do use these services and who our carriers are and what we're so that they have our personal perspective. Netflix does measure the bandwidth it thinks it's getting from each of the carriers and publishes that information, uh, which is sort of interesting. And they are the single biggest problem here. They're essentially the point of disruption that's causing a lot of what's going on.
Yeah, as I've seen it, Netflix is 30+% of the entirety of internet traffic, and it's not only that, but as we've talked privately, there's a disproportionate usage across ISPs, and that this has an effect on everybody's bottom line. And maybe we should tell people, you should try to explain to people what that means for
Sure.
the ISPs.
Yeah. So I mean, essentially, there are two big effects going on here, and one of which is this whole argument that Netflix had with Comcast around asymmetry. And what that means is, in the world of the internet as it was invented, it was expected that most traffic, not any individual source to an individual destination, would be symmetric. In other words, you and I send each other about the same amount of bandwidth, but in aggregate it would be. Well, Netflix disrupted it because Netflix's bandwidth is so large in such a big percentage, and it's almost all from network to the consumer. That means that there's this huge asymmetry that's occurred between Netflix as a source and all the ISPs as sync, and there are ways of handling it in the telephone network. There has not been an effective way of dealing with that in the internet from a money standpoint, and we'll come back to that. The second thing, and the one that's the other half of the problem here, and it's a slightly different thing to think about, and that is people that built and pricing for internet service providers, and this is not Netflix's fault, by the way, this second one, built it with this idea of a transactional model. When you download a web page, when you do an email, it's a burst transaction. So there's burst of activity, big long space in the middle where nothing's going on, burst of activity, big long space. And what that allows them to do is add all that traffic together as an aggregate and actually combine it in a way that saves them a lot of bandwidth deeper into the network. So if you look at the core of the internet and ask it, how many bits per second are there per subscriber on the internet? Well, at the edge, there's a very high number, megabits. In the core of the network, it's in the hundreds of kilobits range. So as you do more streaming, as you do more machine-to-machine communication, the average bandwidth per consumer goes up, especially when you stream video. Now, so what does that mean? That means deep in the network, they need to add more and more bandwidth. Well, the problem is the way we've decided to charge for internet service. So the best way I can describe it is the bit rate as described at the port that arrives at your home. Does that last bit make any sense?
Yeah, they're basically charging you for the very final consumer product that you're seeing, rather than this huge infrastructure that is quite expensive, all behind the scenes. And so all
Well,
we're seeing is the little dribble at the end, and that's what we're getting
and more than
charged
that.
for. Essentially.
So if you think about it, if you look at our setup, we've got a cable modem sitting here talking to the cable network, and essentially for us to get a higher speed service, we could buy a higher speed service or a lower speed service. The equipment doesn't change, right? Now, if we use more bandwidth of the service that we've got, that equipment at the edge doesn't change. What happens is when it arrives with everybody else's traffic back at the head end of the cable, now that starts to getting more traffic and it gets exponential, and that's where the problem starts. And the deeper in the network you get, if the average bandwidth per consumer goes up, then the whole thing blows away. So let me use some numbers so that this is clearer. So we live in the city of Santa Rosa. It's a city of about 150,000 people. That means there's about 30,000 residences in town, right? Let's just use that, say 5 people per house. That's a good number. So at 1 megabit of traffic, right, that's 30 gigabits for the city of Santa Rosa, right? That's a pretty big number.
So yeah.
Okay. Now let's take that to 10 megabits. Now you're at 300 gigabits. Do you see what I'm saying? And one of the challenges, and this is one of the big distinctions that people have found out with internet traffic versus phone traffic, is when people engineered phone networks, 80% of phone calls at any point in the network were local to where you were in the network. Okay? In the internet, 80% of the connections are remote from wherever you are. So that means that if you've got 30 gigabits here running around Santa Rosa, 24 gigabits of that want to get away from Santa Rosa and go somewhere else. And so as the average speed at the edge increases, the pressure put on the center of the network gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, again, what we charge for is, you get a 10 meg service or a 25 meg service, and that's what you charge for. Nobody says, and by the way, it's going to be able to, download movies at that speed no matter what happens. Today, the internet is what's a best effort service. So you get what you get, and if it stops working, it stops working. Unlike the phone network, which is supposed to be, you should always be able to make a phone call. It's not always true, but that's the idea. And those are the two sort of endpoints of how traffic can get managed.
Okay. So I feel we've covered a good amount of the present crisis, or
sure,
air quotes again, our present situation, kind of the history leading up to it. I went through, in particular, 4 different YouTube channels that had a sort of doom and gloom about what's coming, and picked out some of the points that each one had individually, and in particular ones that went across each of these channels.
Okay.
And I wanted to kind of throw them at you, and we could talk a little about them and give the expert's opinion on kind of what's going on.
Sure.
So the first one is PBS Idea Channel. So his basic presence is a guy, Mike Rugnetta. I'm hoping I'm saying that correctly. He prefaced his video with "This is my opinion based on what I have seen." So I want to throw that out there to make sure that this is a him opinion kind of thing.
Okay.
But he felt that the internet should become a public utility. And I was wondering if you could throw at us kind of what the effects of what becoming a public utility would have on the internet as compared to, what it's not like now.
Okay, so I understand the request. There's a couple forms of public utility, and he needs to be a bit more specific about it. And I'm going to compare it to the road network and to the power network. The power network is a public utility, but it's managed by private companies. Like we get our power from PG&E. and the road network is provided by the local governments. In general, in utilities, things move very slowly. That's been always the big challenge. And in fact, the phone network was always treated as a public utility like the power network back in the day. And innovation was extraordinarily slow, with one exception. And the exception was the internal of the network. And in that case, essentially, Bell Labs invented new technology to make phone calls cheaper and easier to make, and the network cheaper and easier to operate. They didn't spend a lot of time innovating on consumer services and services in general, which is what we've seen in the network. So my concern with a public utility is simply innovation, is how much money will people be willing to spend on an innovation on a public utility. Let me give you two economic models so you understand what I mean by that. In the old days, the phone network used to be what was called a rate of return network. And what that meant was the phone companies were guaranteed a return on investment for all their equipment purchases. And in fact, the job of the FCC and those state public utility commissions in those days was to limit spending on the networks, because the best way for a carrier to make money was to spend more money because they were guaranteed a rate of return on it. Okay, that's the way that carriers were regulated back in their public utility days. The other thing on the road side is, remember, at that point, it's taxpayer-supported money, and then we'd be arguing about who gets contracts at a governmental level, and why would we have competing networks, because it would be inefficient. So those are things to think about as you get into the public utility idea.
Okay. Another problem that they all had was this worry about fast lanes.
Yeah.
So yeah. So everybody's worried that Comcast in particular, particularly saying that they want to buy Time Warner, like of course they do, the second largest ISP. They are worried that Comcast is going to put in some speed bumps into whatever the regular network is, what everybody has right now, and then you're going to be able to purchase kind of the speeds we're looking at now, but for exorbitant, amounts of cash. Could you? Is this even feasible for them to do?
The answer to that is sort of yes and sort of no. So the first off, let's talk about what fast lanes, and it is such a horrible term. There's a guy named Dan Grossman at NetAccess Futures, which has a really good way of describing that, and I recommend people go read his blog and talk to Dan. He and I have known each other for some time and competed against each other in the telecommunications business for a very long time. Essentially, what the FCC actually asked for is we talked about the ability to discriminate between traffic. They asked if they should allow that to continue. That's actually the thing that people then talk about as fast lanes. First off, for the large content providers, exception of Google, they already get the best fast lanes possible for video content. That's your cable service. That isn't going away, and they get paid massive amounts of money for Comcast to put their content on those fast lanes. So don't expect Disney to show up and suddenly pay Comcast to deliver their content over the internet. That's just not likely to happen. Now, there are services, both video services and gaming services, which would actually benefit from traffic discrimination. Netflix, for example. And what I mean by that is, imagine you've got this aggregation of traffic and there's congestion. If you're loading up a web page, it could wait behind somebody watching a streaming Netflix video, and you wouldn't notice the difference. The person on the Netflix video would. Second of all, there are some congestion mechanisms inside the internet where if you could avoid using them for streaming traffic, that would be good. All I can tell you is, without getting too technical, is traffic is thrown away randomly in the internet on purpose, even when it's not congested. And that's why sometimes you need to use the refresh button no matter what. So do you have to be really careful to make sure Comcast isn't setting up a deal where they're prioritizing their sites over other people's sites? Yeah, I think that's a fair conclusion. I think that's something to worry about. Do I think fast lanes in terms of them blocking other people's traffic is going to happen? No, I don't. And the reason I say that is every time that, if I go back to the BitTorrent ruling with Verizon, you can see that the FCC has been very harsh about blocking or slowing down people's traffic when the information's been made available to them. Two other problems. Can they do it? At a macro level, the answer is yes. At a micro level, the answer is no. And here's the thing I'll remind everybody. The Chinese government blocks open parts of the internet from arriving in China, and people get around it all the time. You can do that anytime you want to. I could tell you how to do it. I don't want it to, it'd be a long technical explanation for this podcast. But remember, those kind of services exist. Even in the Verizon discussion around BitTorrent, BitTorrent just kept releasing new versions and changing the ports they use and some of their behavioral tactics, and made it really hard for Verizon to block BitTorrent. Second thing is, when you get to this fast lane stuff, it's indiscrimination. The other half of this is going to be, could they build an effective service that they could actually sell to a content provider in a way that makes sense for both of them? I think that's going to be a lot harder for the phone companies than they think it's going to be, or the ISPs. My experience with that is they tend to screw up when they try to do those kind of special arrangements. They're not built for small numbers of special arrangements. They're built for mass quantities of regular arrangements. And if they screw them up, there's going to be these things called service level agreements or contracts associated with how well these services work, and they're likely not to meet them, and then they won't be of any value.
So another portion of this particular worry from these YouTube channels, they see themselves as content providers, and they are, but we've talked privately about how something like Disney does not pay
That's
money
right.
to, say, Comcast to, it's in the same way that an author doesn't pay the publisher
Correct.
to get their books published. But they all seem to be fairly worried about the fact that that the ISPs will start extorting the content providers and saying things like, oh, hey, looks like I got let's use like a delivery service. Like I got a package, from you guys that I could send to your customer, or I could send a package from someone else, but maybe if you send some money our way, maybe, then we'll start getting the packages through. And they're worried that small content providers will start getting charged this way, particularly themselves, given that they are generally small. They're maybe a 10-people team at most, to get some of this content out, and they're worried about having to end up paying Comcast some amount of money, or getting shafted with a much lower bit rate in some way.
I think that's actually a fair concern in one way, and I think it'll get solved a different way, which is, at the end of the day, right? And I'm going to use YouTube as the classic example here. There are other spots you can post this on, but let's just stick with YouTube. Again, as you said, I don't see Disney, and as I've said, I don't see Disney ever paying for this. But can Joe Bob, who wants to set up a YouTube podcast, a video webcast, could he end up paying? The answer to that is, yeah. I think that that's theoretically possible. The challenge is going to be it's not the content person that's going to get charged. It's Google, because Google owns YouTube, right? So if the traffic from Google out to the rest of the world becomes horribly asymmetric because of the amount of video that's coming out of YouTube, then yeah, I think that that's a potential problem, and that Google will have to rethink the business model around YouTube. If you go back 5 years, there weren't any ads on YouTube, and now people, now there's all these little pop-up ads and all this stuff because YouTube used to lose a boatload of money, right? And essentially, Google's an ad company, right? I mean, it's a technology company, but essentially, it's a gigantic advertiser. And that's how they make their money. And that's how they're paying for YouTube, is advertising, right? Is it possible that YouTube will not be able to do that anymore? Yeah, it is possible. I don't see it as likely, but it is possible, and it's something to be watched. Never assume that the little player has an advantage in any of this, but the big players do, and they're not. The big players are not going to be impacted.
So, kind of another portion to the extorting. People see Comcast as fairly close to a monopoly a lot of the time because they're the only ones providing the internet service, at least in their area, and are worried about any kind of abuses that Comcast might come in and apply to them at very high rates. Like some people are worried right now, so they will quote, say, Tokyo in particular from Japan and Korea as having 3 times, 3 times our bit rate, but we get, we're charged 3 times more for what we get, yet we have 10 times less bit rate than they do, and they're worried that Comcast is not necessarily going to be incentivized to actually upgrade services if they're in effect a monopoly that isn't the way they consider properly regulated in some fashion. What can we've talked a little bit about this. Is this something that the FCC is that why they're thinking about the common carriers, Title II common carriers idea, or
sort of? It's a real problem. The U.S. people don't understand how access networks are built, which is essentially the problem here in a lot of my expertise. But the U.S. is actually a lot more expensive to build networks in than Japan or Korea because of the density of housing. And if you think about the number of people that live, we live in a city of, like I said, 150,000 people. Apartments here are relatively rare. There's a lot of single-family dwellings. The architectural density is not very high. I'm aware of Japan's network, how it's built, why it's built. It's not the electronics isn't significantly cheaper than what's done in the U.S. But the construction costs, even in Japan, are lower than they are in the U.S. because of the number of apartment buildings involved and sort of the symmetrical arrangements, a few other items that have been dealt with more efficiently in Japan than they have in the U.S. And we can talk about that at some point in probably a different podcast, the different models for that. But couple of things. So, how many fiber to the home carriers are there in Japan? The answer is 1. So they've got a monopoly too. In fact, it's a bigger monopoly. And in fact, the reason that there's only 1 fiber optic carrier in Japan is because DSL became unregulated, and the carrier in Japan that's doing these very high rates at relatively modest prices. NTT, the incumbent telephone company, they installed that network to defeat the DSL carriers that had come in and were taking significant market share away from NTT in the DSL business. There isn't a significant cable presence in Japan for broadband internet. In fact, cable service is most popular in the U.S. by far, especially for broadband internet. Most European companies don't have strong cable, and neither does China. There is cable in all those places. It's just nowhere near as strong as in the U.S. There's almost always two high-speed internet offerings, depending on what you mean by high speed in most areas. Some places there are more. In Santa Rosa, for example, there are 3, maybe 4. The challenge is they're not available to everybody. They're not exactly equivalent, and it's very hard to make competition. And the reason there's at least 3 here is one is a company called Sonic, which is a local internet service provider. They're doing some fiber optic work in Sebastopol, and everything else they do, they rent telephone lines from AT&T and deliver DSL service over AT&T's phone lines. The reality is it's very expensive to build access networks. Anybody can do that wants to, and they don't, because it's so expensive that outside the few Google cities that are going in place, Google's fiber network that's been going in, I think it's in about 15 or 20 cities at this point, nobody's building a third wireline access network. Now, the other thing I can tell you about the Google access networks is none of them are going into cities with Verizon Fios. And what I think you're starting to see is the reaction from AT&T now about Google and being even more heavily defeated by Comcast and potentially getting them buying Time Warner. They're starting to ramp up their discussion of fiber to the home installations. And my experience with that is that the first person who puts fiber in wins. So fiber is the way to win, and that's what you want. Now, pricing, if they'll have to get down to some sort of tariff service. Doesn't exactly require Title II to do that. It'll be easier. The question I think everybody's got to ask themselves, these are private companies, is putting in Title II common carrier likely to get them to spend more money or less money? So that's another thing to think about here.
Well, what would Title II common carrier status for them? What would that mean for the ISPs? How do you think they would react, and what effect would that have on the internet and the user, the average user?
That's a great question. I think the local ISPs, the Comcast, the AT&Ts, the Verizons, the Charter, the Cablevisions, I actually don't think it's going to make a significant difference to any of them directly. I think it's the deeper in the network where the challenge is going to be. And the reason I say that is, if I go back to Netflix and the Netflix problem, the way this was solved in the telephone network was the exchange of money. So when you made a phone call from Los Angeles to New York, you paid each person along the way a percentage of the cost of the phone call to complete the phone call. Now, what happened is, along the way, people would, as they made phone calls back and forth between New York and Los Angeles, as they balanced out, they just wiped out the money in the middle and they said, okay, everybody's happy. And only those few calls that were, extra from one end to the other was any money actually exchanged. Now, in the internet, if you're somebody like Netflix, what might happen is, if you go to Title II common carrier, is because their traffic's so asymmetric, they may end up paying everybody to deliver their traffic. And if they do, it may raise the prices and cost to Netflix much more than anything else that anybody's talking about. One other challenge with this, that people need to think about is, and this is where I worry on the peering side, which is deeper in the network, is that phone network arrangement that I just talked about was actually a global phenomenon. So it didn't matter what country you were in. If you called from, and this is one of the reasons that international phone calls used to be so expensive. If you called from Los Angeles to Rio, you paid every phone company along the way, and so you had to pay a local Brazilian telephone company to terminate a call to Rio, and vice versa when the company in Rio called the U.S. If the U.S. sets up different rules than everybody else, that could cause some interesting discussions on how services are offered and what countries they're offered in.
Okay. Well, I think we basically went through all of the everybody's concerns, at least of what I could find that was simple.
Okay.
I'd like to give a quick thank to the PBS Idea channel, Vihart's channel, TGP Gray's channel, and the Vlogbrothers channels for their contributions to what we're talking about, as well as, of course, you, Jim Sackman. You probably want to, pimp out your blog a little bit.
Sure. So, and first off, Chris, thank you for having you and me chat. And if anybody wants to read my stuff on jimsackman.wordpress.com, that would be great. I post generally on every Friday on net neutrality and on other issues during the rest of the week.
All right. So that was our first podcast. Thank you for listening, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.